Unfortunately, the report hasn't, uh, it came out in early January, but the 2022 report is getting a bit delayed because of the pandemic. So having said that, I will rely on the latest report available. We'll talk a bit about shifts in how people manage risks, the challenges for the risk management industry with ever-growing risks and the complexity of the risks, and need for an enabling risk management framework. I'll end with a small case study, and I'll try and do so Praveen to slide in the next after that. So building on the perspective really, and pardon me if anybody, kind of is very well versed with Mandarin and what I represent here is not accurate. But to the best of my knowledge, this is accurate. The first character, I'm told, means danger, and the second character means opportunity. And it is really so true about risks. The next slide, Praveen. So the kind of modern economies we live in today, the large industries that we have built, etc., would not have been possible without the ability of so many of you, so many of us having taken huge, significant risks. So small or big, we all take risks in life to build businesses, to build economies, and risk also means opportunity in a sense. While risk, in terms of its meaning, it's a very interesting word. So there's a lot of debate about where the word originates from. And one of the theories is that it originates from the word risicare in Italian, which means to dare. Okay, come and take a risk, that sort of a thing. So risk also means opportunity. I think the other side of the coin is opportunity. And when I think of risks, I always think of an iceberg. So that part of the iceberg, which is very visible, is your physical assets, which we call as first order of risks. So risks that are clearly visible and quantifiable are relatively easier to manage. That part of the iceberg, which is poorly visible, is what we call the second order of risk, such as your potential legal liabilities and so on and so forth. Your third level of risk is indirect economic losses, which is that part of the iceberg which is really poorly visible or not visible at all. So the point that I'm really trying to make is that risks come to us in many forms, and a lot of them are risks that we just cannot predict or think of so easily. So Praveen, the next slide, please. So risks have always been with us, but today they come in new shapes that many of us would not have imagined 25 or 30 years ago. First of all, risks are becoming supersized. The size of economic concentration in large cities, coastal areas, or the size of factories, installations is all becoming large. So risks are becoming supersized. There is also an increasing interconnection or interconnectedness and interdependency between risks. So there's a huge big domino effect of one thing happening in one part of the world, and nothing has taught us better than about this than the pandemic that we have all faced since February, March of last year. The third or fourth point that I want to make about this new generation or emerging risks is the increasing disconnect between risk and mitigation. The pace at which risks are growing in size, complexity, etc., is faster than our ability to find mitigation measures. And they say that mechanisms in place to manage and mitigate risks at the level of businesses, governments, are not really very adequate. And there are many risks, many new generation risks that are just not transferable. We often think of transferring risks. Insurance is a good mechanism to transfer some risks, especially traditional risks. But a lot of new risks are just not transferable. The Global Risk Survey, which I talked about, carried out under the aegis of the World Economic Forum, it divides risks into 5 buckets. And please don't bother if, this reads like a laundry list. So please don't worry too much if you're not able to, count every sector. But exact economic includes, fiscal crises in key economies, failure of major financial mechanism, hard landing of an emerging economy. And there is a lot of talk about some of the large economies really going through some potential crises, oil price shocks, etc. On the environmental side, you have extreme weather events, you have man-made environmental catastrophes, natural catastrophes, you have water crises, especially of fresh water, and failure of climate change mitigation and adaptation, etc. Just show the slide, please. There are 3 other buckets, really. You have the societal, geopolitical, and technological. So on the societal side, we have food supply crisis, income disparity, outbreak of pandemics, unmanageable burden of chronic diseases in several countries, especially emerging economies and liability regimes. So Praveen, if you're still hearing me, the slide is not shifted, unfortunately. Then you have geopolitical risks. And amongst the geopolitical risks, we have fragile states, increasing corruption, large-scale terrorist attacks, diffusion of weapons of mass destruction, violent interstate conflicts, etc. And finally, you have the bucket of technological risks, which is risks like escalation in large-scale cyber attacks, and that's really playing out a lot, and as we're witnessing increasing incidents of cyber attacks and hacking, including some state players and non-state players participating allegedly in such cyber attacks ever since the COVID breakout. Massive incident risks related to technology, etc. So broadly, these are the 5 buckets of risks that the global risks report or survey talks about. Now, moving ahead, I'm going to talk of 2 things, relying once again on the global risks survey. Praveen, the next slide, please. So the global risk survey lists out the top risks by likelihood. Risk is a function of probability, which means the frequency or how likely is the risk likely to happen, and severity. If the risk were to play out, if the risk were to trigger, what could be the financial impact, the severity. So the slide that you see is top global risks by likelihood. And in the latest survey, the top risk was extreme weather, climate action, human environmental damage, infectious diseases, and that's where your pandemic comes in, biodiversity loss, digital power concentration, digital inequality. So the slide here really captures from 2012 onwards, for the next 9 or 10 years, the top 5 risks really. And you see it repeated, income disparity, cyber attacks, extreme weather, pandemics, etc. So the survey is carried out based on an actual interaction and an interview with top CEOs, CFOs of large companies and mid-sized companies across several countries. So if you look at the next slide, which talks of the top global risks by impact, okay, you suddenly find that infectious diseases comes right on top. That is because the survey was carried out following the outbreak of COVID. And then you have climate action, weapons of mass destruction, etc. Whereas this was not the case in previous years. In 2020, failure on climate action, I think, was a major concern. Weapons of mass destruction. In 17, 18, 19, weapons of mass destruction was a major concern. Extreme weather events was a major concern. And why some of these concerns keep on cropping up is, remember, we are talking of impact here, which means severity. If, unfortunately, somebody uses weapons of mass destruction, the kind of financial losses that would result would be kind of nearly catastrophic. So is the case with extreme weather events, increasing hurricanes, increasing natural catastrophes, and with global warming, which I personally think is a reality. I think we have seen increasing frequency in natural catastrophes taking place in several countries around the world. So the next slide, Praveen. So this is a bit of a dense slide. So there is a quadrant here. On the vertical axis, you have impact, that is. On the horizontal axis, you have likelihood, which means probability. Like I said, risk is a function of probability and severity. So infectious diseases, once again, is right on top here. And so there is a scale there, which is trillion US dollars. And the likely impact of this was being projected at somewhere like $4.5 trillion, the pandemic, okay, if it were to break out. It will take years for people to really come up with more accurate or near accurate figures as to what the impact of COVID-19 has been. But trust me, it's definitely going to be in trillions. Okay, the other risks which people think can cause severe financial losses and damages are climate action failures, biodiversity loss, debt crises, cybersecurity failure, extreme weather conditions, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to paint a picture of emerging risks for you. Now, I appreciate that risks play out differently in different countries, in different industries, and not everybody would be impacted by these emerging risks. The next slide, Praveen, please. You can always get impacted by a lot of these risks that I'm talking about. So having painted a picture or having given some idea of emerging risks, I now want to quickly move on and define the changes that are taking place or shifts that are taking place in the world of risk management. So there are a lot of external factors impacting the way we manage risks. The first is globalization. The second is rising importance of intellectual capital versus physical capital. Please remember, I also said that physical capital, assets, physical assets, etc., are that part of the iceberg which is clearly visible and therefore easier to manage. Regulatory risks. I was carrying out a risk management exercise for the board of a pharmaceutical company, and they just wouldn't bother. I don't want to name the company. It's not fair for me to name the company, but it was a company that used to manufacture a lot of generic drugs, and they were playing around in the gray zone with a lot of intellectual property related kind of issues as they were exporting drugs to the United States. And we kept on telling them that your strategy comes very close to courting litigation, which means you could potentially face issues with the drug control authorities in the US. And that is precisely what happened. The company ceased to exist. It had to be sold off because they were sued to hell in the US. And also they got sold meanwhile, and they had not revealed to the seller the kind of issues that were being faced by them in the US, and everything did not come out in the due diligence, and the company was really sued to hell. Then there is an issue of more exposed supply chains as companies increase outsourcing. And indeed, there has been a lot of talk about exposed supply chains following COVID. I don't know if anybody is dialed in from Thailand, and no offense meant, but when you had the floods in Thailand a few years ago, I don't recall the year. There were a lot of supply chains, especially in the automobile sector, that got impacted, especially as far as the Japanese auto industry is concerned. And then you have this question of just-in-time inventory systems. So all these things put together are kind of changing the way people expect us to manage risks. And risk management is therefore becoming a much more important agenda item because of pressure from investors, from rating agencies, from security analysts, regulators, and boards of companies are therefore paying closer attention to risk. The next slide, please. So what are the challenges for people like us who either run businesses or are expected to analyze risks? First of all, the ability to identify risks requires multiple skill sets, especially enterprise-wide risks. Okay, but traditional risk managers, especially those in insurance, and I am in insurance for a number of years, the insurance industry has too narrow a view of risks. They mainly look at physical assets. They lack understanding of customers, businesses, etc., and they're too heavily focused on physical assets and not on new generation risks, or not on intellectual capital, etc., etc. And they have a very transactional approach to risks, which needs to shift to a balance sheet kind of an approach to managing risks. The next slide, please, Praveen. So when it comes to businesses, and this is where I start talking about you. So, I've divided risks into 5 buckets here. You face strategic risks. There are financial risks, operational risks, reputational risks, which are very, very difficult to manage. And then there are liability risks. So on the strategic side, you often end up taking decisions as to what business to get in, which markets to get into, what challenges you can face from competition, what are the kind of political shifts that can take place. So one of the businesses, one of the countries that used to report into me in my current role was Tanzania. And no offense meant to any of the political regimes there, but our business suffered the moment there was a shift in the political kind of ruling party. So on the financial side, you have to reckon with currency, interest rates, credit, liquidity. And I think credit risk is really a big one, especially if you are an SME business. And of course, there are our own operational risks, which are more internal to us, our own processes, controls, the risk of our business getting interrupted. And then there are reputational risks, which are really serious. And then liabilities. I gave one example of a liability, which was patent or copyright infringement. But then there's environmental pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So Praveen, the next slide. So whatever be the risks that you face, I think I would recommend, and you can do it yourself, you can take external help. It's better to do something about them rather than not doing anything. And that is what I really wanted to communicate to you today. You need to be able to identify, measure, and if you're able to do this, you'll be able to manage and monitor better. The next slide, Praveen. So what I would recommend is a need, therefore, for an enabling risk management framework. And I will quickly take you through a risk management framework, the next slide, which I call as total risk mapping, which is a simple and yet very powerful risk management decision-making tool. It can be done through a team within your own company, comprising of 7 people from various functions. There may be times when there's one person looking after legal, the same person is looking after commercial or financial, so be it. But typically commercial, legal, financial, technical, all those kind of inputs need to come in when you're carrying out a risk analysis in terms of identifying risks. So the idea is to capture the existing wisdom within your company, because nobody knows your business better than you, and come out with some sort of a catalog, which we call as a risk catalog or a vulnerability catalog. I'll take you through the process in the next slide, Praveen. So the first part is mapping. Don't worry too much about modeling, okay? But you should be able to identify each and every risk in a risk catalog. Risk number one, so and so, risk number two, so and try and assign ratings to it. Whether it's low, medium, high, in terms of the likelihood of the risk, and in terms of severity or the impact, whether again it's low, medium, high. This will enable you to come up with mitigation options or mitigating options, whether it's strategic, whether it's an operational change, whether it's insurance, or even when it is retention, that you have to retain it yourself, you can come up with some mitigation measures. The next slide, Praveen. So what you have to do at stage one is look at all categories of risks, legal risks, if you're exporting, credit risks, what are the regulatory risks in the countries that you're exporting to, et cetera, et cetera. And having identified them, what is the probability? What is the severity? Don't worry about quantification, that's more for experts. And then finally, develop prioritization actions. If the risk is highly probable and also at the same time, it has a high impact in terms of financial impact, I think you would definitely like to take measures to bring the risk down, either insure it or transfer it contractually to somebody else if possible, so on and so forth. The next slide, Praveen. So I think you can do it yourself, okay? But an external help, if available, always is good. Define the scope, look at the kind of risks yourself, select a team and a team leader who can facilitate, identify the vulnerabilities, threats, and sources of risks, try and look at scenarios. So, so let us say you're exporting automobile parts to various countries, or you want to start exporting. You may not be exporting today. Tomorrow, you may want to start exporting those parts. So look at various scenarios. What can happen? What are the regulatory risks? What are the credit risks, and so on and so forth. And then after you have defined those scenarios, start rating these risks. What is the probability of the risk triggering? And if it triggers, what could be the financial impact, so on and so forth. So I will end with a case study. Okay. Praveen, if you could shift 2 slides, please. Yeah, the next one. So this is a case study, of the next slide, please. This is a case study of an automobile manufacturing company, which I was personally involved in. And we agreed on certain objectives with the management of the company, which was to identify and measure risks, come up with a risk catalog, capturing probability and severity. And also they wanted to know what's the quality then a portfolio on the basis of risks identified, and whether it addressed the client's risk appetite, whether it protected their balance sheet, and then provide them multiple options and so on and so forth. The next slide, Praveen. So what we did was, in order to identify the risks, we did a lot of secondary analysis, and secondary research is very, very important. Thanks to the net, it's so easy to find out, what's happening in each country today, whether on the regulatory side, on the currency side, etc., on the societal side, so on and so forth. Okay. The next step was to sit down with 10 or 12 people from this company who represented critical functions like legal, finance, technical, commercial, so on and so forth, and test with them whether the risks identified by us needed more elaboration, and then elaborate on more risks together with their help, start assigning probability, severity, etc., and then finally come up with a catalog. So the next 2-3 slides is the catalog that we came up with. So Praveen, if you could, shift. Yeah. So obviously, ratings. So probability we rated high, moderate, low. Impact we rated high, moderate, low. And there were financial numbers behind it, because what may be a company depends on the sheet. So for a company, $1 million may be very high. For one company, $1 million may be negligible or not even worth looking at. For another company, so on and so forth. And then what was the adequacy of the insurance program? So we gave ratings for the adequacy of the insurance program. So the next slide, please. So we realized that, so if you look, so on the probability side, the problem impacts a lot of red. Okay, so they were either retaining the risk themselves or partly transferring to insurance, whether when insurance solutions were available. Okay, so our comment right at the bottom was that a significant portion of risks mentioned above are currently retained by this company on their balance sheet. Okay, and some of these retained risks have a high probability of occurrence and high potential impact. The next slide, Praveen. Similarly, on the possibility of these risks causing business interruption, again, we found the same thing. So for example, supply hazard, they insured it, but they were not insuring it. They were retaining it, and so on and so forth. The next slide. So similarly, when we looked at general liability, we found the same thing. And trust me, when all this went up to the board of the company, they realized that they were facing a situation where if any of these risks had triggered, it could have really, really made a major dent in their balance sheet. It could have caused a lot of embarrassment and reputation loss at the listed company. So it could have led to a significant impact on their share price. So what are the key takeaways really from this case study? The next slide, Praveen. So this company we found retained a significant number of risks, and the next slide. And even where they had insured, we found that they were substantially either underinsured, and as a matter of fact, a colleague of mine jokingly told them, because one of their plants was in an area which saw a lot of flooding in the hills and in India. And so one of my colleagues jokingly told them that, look, the money that you will get from insurance company will be less than what you will get by selling the scrap and salvage if there were a major flood. Okay. So to conclude, what I would say is have a structured approach. Okay. The structured approach should be such that either you're able to do it yourself or take some outside help, but it's better to do something rather than not doing anything. So focus on your business objectives, do a rudimentary risk analysis, which means identify the risk, try and assign ratings to it, probability, severity, and then look at mitigation options. And this way you will be able to institutionalize the process of managing risks, and every time you do it, you get better. Do it at least annually. So that is all I had to say. I'm sorry, there were some technical glitches, and I did exceed by about 3-4 minutes. So I would love to take questions.